Well, not long ago, the BBC sponsored a research project to study what happens in the human body over time. So, this is what you will accomplish over the course of an average lifespan. Are you ready? Here's some numbers for you. So, over the course of an average life, you will spend 3.5 years eating. Some of us maybe more than that, but we won't get into that now. As part of that marathon meal, you will eat 7,300 eggs, 352 pounds of chocolate. Some of us are working to raise that curve as well. But we're also going to do some things to burn some of that off. In the first year of life, the average baby will crawl 90 miles. And over the span of a lifetime, we will walk 13,200 miles. It gets better. The average person over the course of their lifespan will grow 92.4 feet of fingernails, 570 miles of hair on your head, and 6.6 feet of hair in your nose. We are all going to accomplish so much in this life. Now, I'm sure, though, that all of us would like to accomplish more than just those things, right? We want to get to the end of our life and know that we've accomplished something, right? That there's been something that we've been a part of that's significant. We have this built-in need for significance or purpose. We have a deep need as human beings to be a part of some mission. We don't want to just go through life going through the motions. We want it to matter. And the busier we are, the faster pace our life gets, the more important it is, because there's all these things happening. It's so important to know what that purpose is, what that mission is, to get clear about that, because there's so many things that we could do. One of my favorite quotes by George Bernard Shaw talks about this issue and how, if we don't commit ourselves to our purpose, our life is going to not go into a good place. Here's what he said. He says, "This is the true joy of life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown out on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of being a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy." A little bit in your face there, without trying to be judgmental. Can you see that with people? If there's nothing else that we're really devoting ourselves to, it's very easy to just go through life sort of ticked off because it's not going the way you'd like it to go. And so people are, get on this bandwagon. They get on this part of this movement to figure out what your mission is. And so there's a whole industry of life coaches and leadership coaches and consultants, time management organizations that put together seminars and events and retreats where people can go and find their mission. And the culmination of this then is to write out your personal mission statement. Now, this is all great. It's super helpful to do, super important to do. But there's an assumption built in sometimes. And that assumption is that what's important is that you have a mission statement, that you have a purpose. Doesn't matter what it is, just have one. That can't be true, right? I mean, because think about it. Haven't we all known people, or at least maybe heard about people, who were very focused, who had a mission, They were very committed to it, but it was destructive or it was empty, like not worthy of them. Think about this. Who are the most purpose-driven people on the planet? Terrorists, right? They're like totally devoted to this purpose. They will give up their lives for this political cause, whatever it is. They will kill or be killed because they're so committed to it. They're clear about the mission, but the mission is not a life-giving mission. So some people devote their lives to revenge, to getting back at someone, or to proving someone wrong. Some people devote their lives to climbing the ladder of success and proving to everybody around them how great they are, or having all kinds of stuff. Having a mission is not enough. I don't want to say it's got to be the right mission, as if I know what the right mission is for people, but it's got to be a mission that is life-giving. And what we believe as Christians is it's got to be in alignment with God's mission for us, right? If God created us, God knows what a flourishing life is. God placed us here. The important thing then is to figure out what that mission is and to ensure that our mission is in alignment with His mission, right? So that's what's significant. Paul understood this. The Apostle Paul got this, and he devoted himself to a mission that he understood that God had given him. So, like in the book of Acts, for example, Acts chapter 20 tells us account of Paul. He is towards the end of his life here, and he's with some people, and then he's leaving on this trip, and he thinks he's probably not going to see him again. Okay. And so these are kind of his parting words to these friends. In Acts 20, verse 24, he says to them, "The most important thing is that I complete my mission, the work that the Lord Jesus gave me to tell people about the good news about God's grace." That was his mission, telling people about the good news of God's grace. That's what he understood. And in verse 12 of the passage you have there, Philippians 1, he says, "I want you to know that whatever has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." So advancing the gospel, that's what he cared about. That's what he was committed to. So Paul had this deep commitment to fulfilling God's purpose. So what does that look like? What does that mean? Because if we understand what it meant for Paul and kind of see how it worked out in Paul's life, that's going to give us some insights about what that might mean, what it might look like in our own life. So again, I hope you have your Bible open, and there's also in the worship handout or the bulletin, there's a place to write notes. We're going to talk about three things that a clear commitment to God's purposes, what that brings us. All right? So this was true in Paul's life, will be true for us if we have a similar kind of commitment like that. And the first one is, if we have a clear commitment to God's purpose for our lives, that's going to give us perspective. It's going to clarify our perspective. And that's what Paul is kind of getting at in those verses of the first kind of paragraph of our text, which is verses 12 through 18. Our mission gives us perspective. It helps us to interpret what's going on in our lives. So when something happens to you, is it good or bad? Right? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it something that you feel good about? I mean, how do you evaluate it? What's the criteria? And so if we have a mission, if we have a purpose, if that thing brings us closer to that purpose, then it's good. And if it takes us further away, then it's bad, right? So if our mission is, if our purpose and mission is like advancing in our career, then we evaluate anything and everything dependent on whether it's going to advance our career or not. If our purpose is centered around a person, then we're going to evaluate anything and everything based on questions of, is this good for this person? Is this good for our relationship or not? Is it going to pull us together or is it going to pull us apart? That's how we think about everything. That's the perspective. Our purpose creates our perspective. And the way you can tell if you're really committed to something, to a mission outside of yourself, is if something happens that's like bad for you personally, but good for the mission. That then if you're actually still can see the good in it because of what it does for the mission, that's like a game changer right there. So look at the Apostle Paul in verse 12. In fact, I'll put this one up on the screen. You have it there in the text. He says, I want you to know that what's happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. So he talks a lot here about what happened to him. There was a lot that happened to Paul. Now, we've talked about this before, but let me just tick off the list again. He was arrested. He was falsely accused. He was beaten. He was held in prison. He was shipwrecked at sea. He's now sitting under house arrest, chained to a Roman guard at all times, with the threat of death. He's going to be making his case shortly. Basically kind of off the whatever path he has of going out and preaching, that's now gone. He's stuck in prison. And yet, he says, yeah, what's happening to me, this is a good thing. How does that work? How can he say that and actually mean it? In fact, later in verse 18, if you look at verse 18, he actually says, I rejoice. I'm happy about this. So he's happy about this because the mission that he has devoted his life to is actually being advanced. That's how he can be happy. So 3 things are going on, and again, there's space in the notes. I've made these as an outline. So 3 things are happening as a result of Paul's imprisonment, and this is why he's happy. Number 1, the message of Christ is going further out. The message of Christ is actually expanding counterintuitively. This is actually a good thing in terms of the advancement of the gospel. The palace guard that he is in chains, these people that are like around him in the prison, they're hearing the message of Christ. So in other words, like he's got this guy chained to him. So on the one hand, Paul is chained to this guy, but it's also true that this guy is chained to Paul, right? And Paul is got a captive audience and telling them about the gospel. But he's talking to soldiers, he's talking to other high-ranking Roman officials, he's even talked to kings, and he's going to be talking to the emperor, the Roman emperor at some point here. This whole experience of him getting arrested and being in prison all these years, actually, it sort of looked like a really bad thing, but there's ways that it actually brought the gospel out to the higher recesses of Roman society. Gerald Hawthorne, a New Testament scholar, he puts it this way. He said, when Paul was arrested in Jerusalem and then shut away in prison in Caesarea, one could easily imagine that this was the end of his ministry, especially as his imprisonment dragged on for month after month. But in the providence of God, the place of his imprisonment, the praetorium of Herod, and the length of his imprisonment both served to thrust the gospel up to higher levels of Roman society than it had ever reached before. You just never know. You just never know how something that might feel like a setback to you, might feel like the worst thing ever, actually, as God works his purposes out in the world, can actually be turned around for good. So there's another thing that's going on. So that it brings the gospel further out, but also because of Paul's imprisonment, other Christians were getting more bold. Verse 14, they're talking more about their faith. Now, it doesn't imply that they weren't talking about Christ before. It's just that now they're talking about Christ even more boldly. And then there's a flip side of that. They're yeah, maybe some of them are doing that for wrong reasons. So that's verse 15. Some of them are doing so. In fact, verses 15, 16, and 17 are doing it with wrong motives. So, by the way, have you ever heard a teacher or a preacher or a televangelist who's preaching the gospel with what seems to be messed up motives? Like, they're on the one hand, they're preaching the gospel, but they're really just trying to get rich or whatever. Let's be honest. We are all human, sinful, fallen people. And so even the best of us, we're going to have some mixed motives. But some people, it can be really, really dysfunctional, where on the one hand, they're doing things seemingly for God, but on the other hand, it's like there's so many other less noble reasons that they're really doing it. They want the power. They have some sort of narcissistic need to have people listening to them, or again, financial gain, or whatever it is. And maybe you've been disillusioned by people like that. The good news is that God is so great, and the message of Christ is so powerful, that God can take even that, and God can use even those crazy, mixed up vessels and still use them to accomplish good purposes. So Paul says in verse 18, if you got your Bible there, look at verse 18. What does it matter? They're preaching the gospel out of these. There were people who were preaching the gospel who were stirring things up to make it harder for Paul. That's how screwed up their motives were. And yet Paul says, that's okay. What does it matter? Because the gospel's getting out. That's the point. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter so much what their motives are. I mean, that's between them and God. They'll be judged according to that. But from the big picture standpoint, doesn't matter, because the bottom line is the message is getting out. False motives or true or pure, Christ is being preached. And for this, I rejoice, Paul says. So that's what the commitment to God's purpose is going to do, is it's going to shape your perspective, shape my perspective. Okay, we'll move a little quicker now. The second thing that it will do is it will focus our priorities. If you have no mission in life, anything and everything is going to be appealing or not appealing. How do you choose what to focus on? How do you decide what matters if you don't have that center that allows you to say, this is what's important to me? True story. San Antonio, Texas. It's a 99-degree day, which is actually just an average day in San Antonio. But a woman and her mom. No, it's the mother. Yeah, it's a woman and her sister. So the mother of a baby and the aunt of the baby stop at a store and accidentally leave the baby in the car, and it's in a locked car, and it's hot, and it's becoming, they can't get in. They're running around. They call 911, and and this, for whatever reason, it's taking a long time. The baby is like turning purple. The first person on the scene is a guy named Fred Areola. He was the wrecker driver. So I don't know how he gets there first, and realizes it's a life or death situation. And he doesn't even try to get the thing where he has to try to jimmy the thing. He just gets a hammer, smashes the window, opens the car door, and takes the kid out. Was he a hero? Was he applauded? The woman was ticked off. She was mad. Here's what he said. He says, the lady was mad at me because I broke the window of her car. I just thought, what's more important, the baby or the window? Right? We need to have a clear sense of priorities. And it's crazy to imagine someone running around like, should I break the window or should I save my kid? Why would you do that? Just shut up and break the window, because the kid is obviously more important, right? Stop wasting time. So we said earlier that a deep commitment to God's purposes clarifies our perspective, right? It helps us to evaluate what's going on, but it also helps us evaluate how we go through life and what matters and where to place our attention and focus. If we are unclear about our mission, about our purpose, we're going to drift all over the place. Because if you are not clear about your mission, there's 50 million people who have ideas for how you should live your life. Isn't that true? And most of them involve people wanting your money, wanting your time for this, that, or the other thing. In verses 19 through 26, we see a little bit about how Paul is thinking about his future. He's obviously, makes sense, he's thinking about the possibility that he is not going to live, that he's going to be executed. And here's what he says, verse 22, if I go on living, this will mean fruitful labor. It will help. It'll help the people that he's writing to make progress and have joy in their faith. But if he dies, then he will be with God, and he said that would be great. It would be great to be with God in heaven. So think about then, how does he evaluate this and his priorities? He thinks it would be better, on the one hand, to be with God, but on the other hand, it would be better to continue to live so that his freedom, his release from prison, would actually bring encouragement to the people around them. He had a deeply intimate relationship with God, genuine desire to be with God in heaven, but also his number one concern was the mission, was the purpose of spreading the gospel. And so he's like, it might advance the gospel more if I am able to live and then continue on. So that's what he wanted. So a clear sign of your clarity of this commitment is that it gets worked out in your priorities. It focuses our priorities. Okay, finally, the third thing that it does is it shapes how we live. It shapes our pattern of living. And we see this in the last paragraph of the text, that's verses 27 to 30. Who is it that shapes how you live? Who shapes how I live? I mean, this is a complex question, obviously. I mean, because on the one hand, our parents, our upbringing shapes a lot of the decisions we make, our commitments, how we live. Our friends, there's actually some debate as kids are growing up, which has the greater effect, the parents or the peer group. So our friends, the people we hang out with, our schooling, church we go to, but also the stuff we watch, right? The media that we're exposed to, the things that we read. So I got to say, I'm getting excited because July is the time when NFL teams start their fall training camp. And I have a hard time watching any sports on TV these days, but I do like to watch football still. And whenever I think about football, I think of the Super Bowl. And so, again, I don't know if it's ADD or what it is for me. I have to watch football. I have to tape the games and then watch them in retrospect. Of course, not listening to anything on the radio or seeing anything on social media because I don't want to know what the final result is. I want to watch it with the drama, but I have to watch it in retrospect because I fast forward through the commercials because I hate the commercials. Are you the same way? And especially NFL games. It's like there's, 30 minutes of action, I think, in a 3-hour game. So anyways, all these commercials, so I fast forward through them all, except for the Super Bowl, right? So that's the one game where like most people just watch it and they almost pay as much attention to the ads in the Super Bowl as they do for the actual game itself. Now, how much do you think companies spend for Super Bowl ads? So I checked this week. This past year, the average was $7 million for a 30-second commercial. $7 million. And I read this story about a woman who started a company. She started a business in her home This was a couple years ago, and at that point, it was $2 million for a 30-second ad. She started a company in her home, and it had been going on for 2 years. And I don't know what she was doing it, but she, in 2 years, had built up $500,000 in annual revenue. That's a pretty good deal, right? 500,000. That was her annual revenue. And so what she did is she bought a Super Bowl ad. So spent 4 times the annual revenue of her business on a 30-second ad. Why would someone do that? I mean, someone is not going to spend put their whole dream at risk and spend all that money unless they know it's going to have an effect. We are so used to living in this world. We forget. We need to be reminded of this. Businesses are not stupid. They spend that money because they know that watching even a 30-second commercial will have an impact on the decisions we make about how we live our lives. So just think about that. So who and what we are filling our minds with then shapes our lives. It changes how we live. So companies and organizations spend all this time because they bank on the reality that by putting this stuff in front of us, it's going to change how we live. We don't like to admit it, but it's the reality that probably today, the media that we consume shapes our lives, I don't know, maybe more than anything. So I know that it's just one of the many influences, but it's so important that we are aware of this and honest about what that means for how we're going about our lives. So Paul pretty much made this choice, and he challenges the readers to make the choice and us to make the choice then. Says that whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. That's verse 27. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel, so that whether I come back to visit you again or not, whether the persecution we're experiencing lightens up or gets worse, just follow Christ. And one of the manifestations of that deep commitment to following Christ is that it will shape how we live. It will shape what we watch. It will shape who we listen to. It will shape who we spend time with, what we spend time doing. So we want to get on board with that and be a part of God's purpose for how we live. It changes our perspective, as we said, focuses our priorities, and it shapes our pattern of life. So I want to end with this story. I'm sure it's very familiar to you guys. This is a picture of Viktor Frankl. He was arrested by the Nazis in World War II. He was a he was a professor and a psychiatrist, or psychologist rather. And when the Nazis arrested him, they took everything. They took his family. They separated his family. Many of them died. They took his home. They took all of his possessions. He'd spent 7 years researching and writing a book about the importance of finding meaning in life. And when he was arrested and he was sent to Auschwitz, he actually took the manuscript of what he had written and sewed it in the lining of his coat so that they wouldn't confiscate it. But somehow the guards found it at some point and took even that away from him. And so he had to struggle in a very profound way with this issue of meaning and like living out what he, had been studying, devoting his life to. Well, he was wrestling with this a lot, and the turning point for him, I didn't know this. I found this out when I was reading his story just this week, that as he's wrestling with this question and becoming getting very, very low, as you can only imagine how low someone would be, What would happen is when prisoners would be taken away to the gas chambers, sometimes they'd have stuff. Like this person was taken to the gas chambers, died, and his coat then was left, and so then they would give their stuff to other prisoners. So he got the coat of a prisoner who had just died, and in this coat he reached in the pocket was a page torn out of the Hebrew prayer book, and it contained the prayer of Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, and the prayer goes, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. The Lord is one God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." And he, in retrospect, said that was this turning point for him, where he felt he was being called by God, challenged to live out his ideas, and to actually experience them and live them, not rather than just writing about them. And so then later on, he reflected about this experience, and this is what I want to leave you. And it's a quote, probably one of the most famous quotes of the 20th century. He says this: "There's nothing in the world that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning to one's life." And then he goes on to say, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." So that's the question I want to leave us all with. I believe this passage leaves us with. What is your why? What is the purpose that you are focusing, channeling the direction of your life? And is it big enough? Is it worthy of you? Is it integrated with God's purpose for the world and God's purpose here in this community? And think of how it could be if you're not sure, but think of how you could shift and clarify that purpose to do that. Think how cool it would be if we all did that, and we're a part of God's movement and God's work here in Princeton.